I did my undergrad at Chico State up in Northern California, and I learned so much from Don Hankins, and I'm so excited to welcome him now as someone who works here at California Academy of Sciences to come share his knowledge, his expertise, and yes, I will now introduce him with his bio, but I'm just really excited to have you here, Don, so thank you for being here. Don Hankins is a professor at California State Chico and field director for the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. His expertise spans pyrogeography, water stewardship, and conservation. He draws upon his academic and cultural knowledge as a Miwok traditional cultural practitioner in applied research and projects focused on landscape scale, prescribed, and cultural burns, ecocultural restoration, and environmental policy. Don has been involved in various aspects of land stewardship and conservation for a variety of organizations and agencies, including at the federal level and with Indigenous entities in North America and Australia. He is internationally recognized for his work on Indigenous fire, and he is an advisor to the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, a founder and co-lead and recorder of the Indigenous Stewardship Network, and an appointed member of the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force Executive Committee. Thank you so much, Don, for being here, and welcome. And we're so excited to learn from you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. It's really an exciting opportunity for me. And one, I'll share this, and Olivia asked earlier, like how often, or what were my connections to the Academy as in the past. And I'll say that, like, being able to come here is really an honor, because for me, as a kid growing up on Ramaytush country, just south of here, we came to the Academy quite a bit as a kid, field trips, family trips, you name it. And this really gave me a sense of direction and wanting to engage in science, not only science, but then also connecting it to my own experiences in the outdoors, in and around here. And specifically, when I went away to university, what I had intended to study was not what I'm talking about today. And that when I went away to university at Santa Cruz, my intent was to study white sharks. And white shark research, John McCosker's research here at the Academy, was something that I was very familiar with from the time I was probably in like middle school, and had actually corresponded with him on projects that I was writing up as a senior in high school. And in my senior high school yearbook, there's actually a rendition, dot stipple drawing of white sharks that was really at the heart of it. And so the Academy really set the foundation for my interest in the sciences. So that's my intro answer to a question that Olivia had asked earlier. But today, what I'm going to share is this idea of climate resilience through ecocultural stewardship. And what I'm drawing from today is a combination of my research, but also a publication that hopefully will be out once I'm done with the revisions on this paper in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, as a perspective piece that's focused on climate resilience in California and the challenges there. I guess we're living in an interesting time. I've been teaching at Chico State for 18 years and doing research in and around Indigenous fire for at least 20 plus years. And it hasn't been until fairly recently that people really started to pay more attention to what the heck I was talking about. At the early part of my career, folks would say, "Oh, that's really interesting. Like you're studying this thing that's historic, like people used to burn, but these things have no application to the future." And for me, I've always looked at Indigenous stewardship as something that's practical to not only what ancestral folks have done in the past, but also to what our future holds. And I think after, thinking about major fires here in the North Bay, Tubbs and Nuns fire in 2017, Camp Fire in 2018, and other fires, Black Summer fires in Australia, And what we've seen happening in Canada over the past couple of years has really brought to forefront the ideas of particularly Indigenous stewardship around fire, but more so what Indigenous stewardship opportunities have for the greater good, and so beyond fire. So in considering this, Indigenous peoples comprise less than 6% of the world's population and steward approximately 80% of the world's biodiversity on about 24% of the Earth's terrestrial environments. And when we think about those numbers that I just threw out, there's a lot of interesting factors of injustice, inequality, and erasure that have happened around that through colonial subjugation and degradation of our natural areas. And these are things that I've been keenly aware of from the time I was little. But it's interesting that we now are seeing these points being brought forward as solutions, that when we look at policies like the state pathway to 30 by 30 document and America the Beautiful as the national example of that, there's a lot of reference to Indigenous stewardship in those documents. And so, you know, as we think about what lays ahead, what opportunities are there, I think it's important for us to always come back to, well, how are these places stewarded, and how can we build those partnerships with people nowadays to be able to do that? And so I'll start with this idea of what I'll call the colonial roots of the climate crisis. It's hard to come up with a picture to really demonstrate that. But, you know, when we consider in Indigenous communities, many people will say that the climate crisis really began at colonization. And so how far back does that actually go? The effects of mass Indigenous depopulation beginning with early European exploration of the Americas, South America, the Caribbean, began very early on. 1492, we start to see a massive depopulation that began through the spread of disease. And it's estimated that 55 million people following 1492 succumbed to disease and died. And as a result of that, created the triggers for the medieval cooling. And so it's interesting to think about like those contact periods and what massive changes were happening. That cooling happened because of the massive revegetation that took place on the terrestrial environment that that had been stewarded differently when more people were present. And I would say that in California, while I can't necessarily say hard numbers wise that 1492 was a trigger point, we definitely know that these depopulations began in the 1540s, and certainly in 1769 when the mission system was established, that massive depopulation occurred, and to the point that there were so few Indigenous peoples living in California in the early 1900s that, you know, the evidence of it was just not present unless you were looking very closely at it. So in thinking about this, then, and rooting ourselves more in the knowledge systems, we have a lot of knowledge that still is retained within Indigenous communities, particularly in the sense of fire is the place that I work. And one of my elders had shared with me something that was shared with her by her elders, that, you know, if people stopped burning, that wildfires would become rampant. And that to me is something that ties to something I'll bring in later in the conversation, but is rooted in an understanding that when wildfires are present within the landscape, that that like we are not doing our jobs, that we are not stewarding our landscapes. And when I think about this, one particular piece of research that Alan Taylor and others did in 2016, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, looked at these sociological historic events and when more climate resilience existed in the efforts of looking at like dendrochronology. And in that work that Taylor and et al. Published in 2016, the only time that California was really in a resilient state was in the time prior to colonization, that there was a decoupled relationship between fire and the climate shifts and the buffering of that. So we have a lot of work to do to be able to get back to that. Other changes that have taken place within our landscapes is that our landscapes have gone through a tremendous amount of change, not only because of the lack of stewardship, but then also because of land use change. And here I'm highlighting an area on the Casumas River Preserve. This is a valley oak forest that's highlighted as a burn unit where we burned in 2013. And what we notice on this particular site is that we've got infrastructure like Highway 99 and farms that are surrounding this area. And, you know, like valley oaks are something as one of our rare ecosystems within the state, roughly like 2% or less remaining. And this happens to be a large patch of them that we're actually trying to steward. But it exemplifies some of the major changes that have taken place. Other things that I would say are important for us to pay attention to around that is that sometimes we walk into places and we look at the landscape and its history doesn't necessarily reveal itself to us. And in the absence of stewardship at this location on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, we have in the center of this photo a couple of valley oak trees that are what I would say are the remnant patches of what Indigenous stewardship had maintained within the landscape. But then following the removal of Indigenous stewardship, the colonization by canyon oaks. And canyon oaks have come in as I'll call it a fire sensitive species because of the absence of fire to be in this place. And so there's major changes that have occurred in our landscape that today, you know, if we it would take a really trained eye to truly read the trees through the forest to understand what potentially could be in place and what may be best suited for climate resilience. The other factor, and this is more looking at present times, but how we see a shift in frequent fire severity, high fire severity, and combinations with drought that are actually converting our landscapes. And in this case, I highlight the wildfire and the Swedes fires in Butte County as an example of where blue oak communities are being have been lost because of these high frequency fires. In fact, there have now been 3 fires in this landscape, and we've lost the forest, and it's being mostly perpetuated by non-native grasses. So what is ecocultural stewardship? What does that relationship look like? As we think of the relationships between indigenous peoples and plants and animals, it's through kinship. That kinship is like truly as a family relationship. When we look at the various species that I have up here, from freshwater mussels to meadowlark to red-legged frogs and red-tailed hawks and California tiger salamanders. In fact, Olivia, you were with me when that picture was taken with the tiger salamanders out of Alcott Lake. They're all species that represent these ecosystems, but they're also culturally important to us. They're species that we have in our kinship systems, you know, our clans, if you will. And when we then also imagine why some of these species are rare, those rare species are important to us because they also have a relationship to then thinking about how our population as humans have declined because of colonization. These species have undergone that. And as indigenous peoples, we have a stronger relationship of understanding and appreciating that decline. So that stewardship then ultimately comes back into the balance of how these species and the ecosystems which they're found in and our roles and responsibilities come together. So in framing what I'll call ecocultural health, as I've said, colonization led to a disconnect between people and country. And I use the term country to represent not only the land itself, the landscape, but also our water environments, the ocean, our rivers, our lakes. Country is an encompassing word. And when people have been removed from country, it has limited the ability to continue cultural practices. sometimes in relationship to policy, which we've had a number of policies within the state since before the state was a state, under Spanish rule, for instance, that limited the use of fire and other cultural practices within the landscape. So when people have no connection to being on country, to be able to steward that country, then being able to pass that information to the next generation is limited. So that's a loss that we see within our communities. Yet the memory of that knowledge is sometimes there, sometimes fragmented, but the knowledge of it's there. And when we start to re-engage with the landscape, when we start to steward again, people, the memory of the land starts to reinvigorate that knowledge within the communities. So really important points to begin with there. Thinking back to the quote that I had from the elder, that fires would become rampant, is based on an idea that's encoded in story. And for us, and I'm really going to talk more about from a Miwok perspective, but in every indigenous community that I've worked with, be it in Australia or elsewhere here in North America, we have an understanding of what are often referred to as our creation stories that tell us of things like the first fires, the first floods, the evolution of species and our relationships within the landscape. And so here I'm highlighting what I'll call our first fire story that tells us that, you know, in the time before humans, fires raged across the landscape, devastated the landscape, and made it difficult for things to be able to survive. But through that, species obtained knowledge of fire, learned to pass the knowledge of fire stewardship on to ultimately as a gift to humans, as a way of taking care of the environment, and as a species with the vocal cords to be able to speak for others. We have that responsibility for the species that we steward. And so those stories are really an important framework for understanding the intricacies of place, of the law, and also tell us the stories of where the origins of species exist at. And I think many of us are probably familiar with these ideas of loci of endemicity, but they're located in a lot of the areas around San Francisco Bay, which coincide not only with these interesting biodiversity hotspots, but they're also cultural diversity hotspots. When we think about and look at these places, they're often places where different tribal boundaries, cultural groups come together, where diverse languages are spoken and different cultural practices come together. And so they're also then framed in a way of understanding the importance of these places in a conservation perspective. I've come to understand that and know it quite well, particularly for our areas of eastern, the Eastern Bay area, the Delta region, out through the Sierras and the Central Valley. And in terms of knowing place, one thing that our stories talk about is the change that has taken place, a record of knowledge that's there talking about long-term environmental change like sea level rise, which from this figure from the Bay Institute from 1992 shows 15,000 years of sea level rise. And when we look at the evidence of like linguistic evidence from San Francisco Bay region, we know that particularly like Ohlone and Miwok communities were more centered in the area where the Carquinez Straits is now, where those rivers come together, and have then, as sea level rise happened, moved out to the places where they're located at currently. So our stories tell us about change. And from my perspective, that change extends from the Farallon Islands to the Sutter Buttes and to places south, and basically frames the location within the landscape of where our world is centered. But it's a dynamic place. We know that dynamism is there. And so our stewardship is rooted in understanding of that dynamism. I've used that information to help me understand things like, I'll say it like science communication around the kinship system. And in what I'll often call ecocultural equality, which is a term that the equality piece is something that people within the community said, well, it's not about getting justice. It's like we want equality, we want equity, And nowadays there's all this discussion around, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, which I didn't understand what that term was until I was like, oh, I've been doing that my whole life. But it's the idea of ecocultural equality is really framed in understanding through the kinship system that we have responsibilities to species just as we do to other cultural groups and things like that. So I began thinking about it in relationship to major projects like the tunnels project, which had been proposed in the Delta. And what our cultural knowledge of those systems looks like. Which species are part of the consultation list in under the California Environmental Quality Act or National Environmental Policy Act? Who's included, who's excluded? What does that landscape look like from a cultural perspective? If we look at this list, we notice that there are no marine mammals listed here. There is no recollection of and recognition of species in the high country of the Sierras. And in our way of understanding, this project would have impacts on that broader system. And so we need to include things in terms of understanding that framework that is much more broader and holistic. So that's just something I'll plant as a seed that has helped me to inform the way that I think about a lot of the work and trying to elevate ways of being more inclusive of species, but also recognizing where the cultural lens fits into it. I'll talk more in these coming examples more in the sphere of fire because it's where a lot of my work is at. From an indigenous perspective, there's a lot of different reasons for burning. Henry Lewis, the anthropologist, back in the 1970s, had talked about there being like 73 different reasons why he'd found that California Indians use fire within the landscape. 73 reasons. I'm sure there's probably more. I mean, I use fire quite a bit, and I always find new reasons for why I would set fire. But they generally fall into these categories that I've highlighted here. Maintaining trails for access, game management, conservation, water stewardship, landscape cleanup, which is actually probably the biggest reason why people burn. It's like it's not aesthetically pleasing anymore. The forest is not healthy looking. We're going to clean it up. And then production of food, medicine, and fiber. Biodiversity plays a big part of that. When we think of the stewardship of our landscape, we know that the effects of the fires creates heterogeneity within the landscape, and that diversity of ecosystems and structures creates the diversity of species, and probably has even shaped the diversity of species that we find within the state based on the genetic plasticity of species within these areas. One thing that I'll highlight is that when we talk about indigenous fire stewardship, what's the scale at which it occurs? A lot of the media that we see currently around indigenous fire is often focused on an individual plant, or it's a small cluster of plants. But does that mean that it's always that way? Does it mean that always indigenous fire is a low intensity burn? There's lots of different kinds of fires, and it really depends on the type of burning that's taking place. But certainly no indigenous fire is going to get to the scale of, say, the Dixie Fire, right? Dixie Fire was almost 1 million acres. Indigenous fires do tend to be smaller, and we look at global examples through satellite imagery, particularly in like Western Australia. Really fantastic analysis by Doug and Rebecca Bird and Mardu authors looking at the patterns that exist from indigenous stewardship. And always indigenous fires are much more patchy. They're tending to be smaller regardless of what's going on in the climate. Yes, on a drier year, you're going to have bigger fires, but they're never going to be the size of wildfires. So there's a lot of facets to indigenous fire. And from the work that I did with Christine Erickson back in 2014, we described how indigenous burning practices are distinguished from other types of burning based on the things that I've already described, like traditional law, the objectives of those burns, the outcomes that come from those burns, and more importantly, what I would say, looking to the future, is the right to burn. And the right to burn is an interesting one because these are things that are passed down through creation as a responsibility to people within the landscape. Currently, indigenous peoples within the United States have self-determination, have congressional Indian law Public Law 93-638 talks about self-determination. Yet our federal agencies fail to recognize what that actually means. Self-determination means that myself as an individual has my own right and responsibility to live on the land as intended. Yet the agencies are not necessarily going to let me go out and set fires where I see it's important within that place until this right to burn is addressed. So we're actually working on that right now. There's a concept that I bring forward in this paper that I've mentioned that hopefully will be out for the public to enjoy in the near future. But it draws from a concept that comes from Yuko, our language, and the word is elte. Specifically for me, like looking at it, it would be eleltek. I'm looking at, I'm seeing, I'm reading is actually what it means. Reading. Here's a language where it's not written, yet we're reading. What the heck does this word actually refer to? I see it as the six senses. Elte involves sensing that is a very deep way of understanding, reading the landscape, seeing the oceanscape. All of those things come together in a way that includes what I call the six senses: sight, smell, sound, touch, taste, and the sixth sense, which is spirit. And from a science background, that may feel weird to talk about spirit. Sometimes we're not, in our very objective ways, not willing to accept the things that we don't understand and don't know. But yet, we can think about things like, I don't know, the way I describe it to my students is this, that if we are open to it and willing to accept it, even the basic things like physics, which I think is probably like the most pure science that there is, Einstein talking about the conservation of energy, that no matter is created or destroyed, that to me is also referring to spirit. So that energy, if you will, is something that that we can imagine as a way of understanding. What does it feel like? What is the gut intuition about something? Is something that we can use to interpret the world around us. And I diagram that here in relationship to fire, thinking about where within the landscape we might vision where a fire might move, why it's going to go out on its own in a certain place based on a shift in ecotone, based on a shift in ecosystems. Like there's a lot of different parameters that flow into that. But it's a way of knowing. It's knowing what and where to burn and when. It's about knowing who is supposed to burn and what the outcomes are going to be. And that comes from a very deep understanding of place, understanding ecosystems and the relationships of species within those places. And I bring that into a real example here from looking at the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. So this is a photo I took maybe 3 weeks ago out on our ecological reserve. And what I'm highlighting here is a transition from buckbrush dominated chaparral to a black oak dominated area. And you can see the difference in the vegetation based on just the visual texture differences. But how would you approach fire in this is going to be totally different, right? Knowing how recently or not recently this place is burned, knowing what would happen if we just had fired this whole thing. You know, like there's different factors that come into it. And so I just sketched out, you know, like what type of fire we would put into these based on that understanding. But also what's not included in this is when seasonally that might take place. And that also involves that idea of elte, thinking of where and how and what we're interpreting within the landscape that are the indicators for when that fire might take place. So that takes me into thinking about some of those indicators. They might include things like the flowering of certain plants that might tell us, well, we don't want to burn at this time because if we burn at this time, we're going to affect the pollinators. In this long tube iris, we see one of the native bumblebees there. So we don't burn during that time. Or we can burn at times to actually enhance the livelihoods of those bees and their success. A lot of that burning takes place in the dormancy when plants and animals are both at rest. But that's not always the practice. A lot of times we're not trying to burn at times when we're going to burn across migratory bird nests, or we're going to affect the breeding of species. And so there's cycles that we have to pay attention to within the systems that we're working in. And not only are we paying attention to the cycles within those systems, but then also the individual species level responses. In this case, I'm highlighting sourberry. Sourberry, Rus trilobata, is an important cultural plant. It's used for food, it's used for medicine, and for fiber, specifically for basket weaving. But if it's not tended to, its productivity decreases, particularly for the cultural uses. And so in the first year or two following fire, you have these really nice shoots that come back that are used for weaving. In the southern Sierras, a lot of the tribal folks are using these for making baby cradles. These strands can also be used for making coiled baskets. But after that first year or two, they start to branch out. And then after about 4 years, they start to produce berries. And then after about 10 years, their production of berries really starts to decrease. And so then you start to think, well, maybe we need to run fire back into it again. So this is a photo of fire on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve from a burn that we did in it was over a year ago. And we just crept fire into the edge of the sourberry as a demonstration. So we have this really nice cycle of old decadent sourberry and regenerating sourberry right on the edge where we can come back and talk about this and educate people around it. I'm going to give a couple of case studies of where and how the stewardship takes place. Again, mostly focused on fire, but I'll bring in some water examples here towards the end. First, I'll begin with what I started doing my research with during my dissertation research, which is fire and riparian ecosystems. Most people intuitively wouldn't necessarily associate fire in riparian ecosystems. From a cultural perspective, these are really important because one, they are where a tremendous amount of our activities were centered on. Many of the villages were located in riparian corridors. The hunting, the fishing, the plant gathering, all is largely tied to these riparian corridors. And if we think about it from a conservation perspective, one, we've got ecosystems that are now, roughly 2% remaining of what historically existed. So there's these isolated patches of riparian. They happen to be the places where roughly 42% of the threatened and endangered species within the state are located within. And when we're not stewarding them, they're becoming vulnerable. And in fact, this picture in the lower left is a picture that I took last week, just north of the town of Colusa, between Colusa Rancheria and the town of Colusa. And this section of riparian forest along the Sacramento River burned, I think, this past summer. But it's a massive area where cottonwood forest is completely burned out because of the lack of stewardship. And so, this is a really important case in point that if we're not stewarding, that's going to be the outcome for the remaining 2% that we've got. So we need to be thinking about how to steward it, and indigenous stewardship in these places is it. So photos that you see here show fire on the McCulmy River in the area of Lockford that were part of my dissertation research. We burned in fall of 2022 during my dissertation research and had really wonderful results. What we found is that species responded very positively to this type of burning. We compared it to other seasons of burning, and the fall burning was by far the best for the native species of plants out there. We hadn't been able to go back out to that site again until December of last year, November, December of last year. So 20 years in the absence of fire. And instead of coming back into a place that was maintained, it was very much overgrown. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to do the other end of the spectrum. It's not going to be a low intensity burn. It's going to have pockets of really high severity, but it needs to open up. And that's exactly what we did. And I don't have the more recent pictures of what it looked like this past spring and summer, but it was amazing. And it looked just like it did when we first started, after we'd gone in and opened it up and did a low intensity burn. Now I want to talk a little bit about oak woodlands. As I mentioned, Our valley oak woodlands are also similarly rare. And likewise, our blue oak communities are also kind of at risk because of the amount of development that's happening in the foothills. Through my research, I know that we've got a tremendous diversity of species found in these woodland ecosystems. In black oak forest, which are these lower pictures here, we have 94 species roughly that are found on the plots that I have established within them. And there's a tremendous number of those species that are culturally important as food, as medicine, and fiber, but also for wildlife that are found within them. And I'll just note this right now because I'll probably forget it otherwise, is that when we burned in the black oak forest at the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, which is the two lower pictures here, that's burning picture obviously, and then the season following. But we have pictures from our game cameras out there following the burns that pine fishers or Pacific fishers are now using our burn areas, which is part of our cultural knowledge of these landscapes. But from an endangered species regulatory perspective, it's still a no-no. So there's a mismatch between indigenous knowledge and science in that regard. Yeah, so there's just a tremendous amount of diversity that's in these places, but that stewardship is really important, obviously, for their maintenance, for maintaining the species diversity. And it's particularly challenging in the case of the valley oak woodlands and the blue oaks, where we've got a lot of invasive species that are present. And the principles of island biogeography really come into play there when we're looking at these fragmented patches and their vulnerability to encroachment by those non-native species. Another example is looking at our meadows and grasslands, and a lot of the focus of the work that I do is really timed to enhance our native grass species. So in this example from the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, we've got a first entry fire happening in fall of 2011, and our most recent burn, which is the third burn in the winter of 2019. We went from a place that was largely dominated by yellow star thistle to a place after 3 burns of having a mix of native sedges and cultural food plants that have since come in. And it's not that we've gotten rid of yellow star thistle, but we've actually enhanced the balance within this place that really helps it to be something totally different. So this leads me into this idea of indigenous-led planning and prioritization. You know, there's lots of different kinds of fire. There's lots of different kinds of stewardship. All of the examples I have here are about fire. One is that in a wildfire perspective, we have lots of wildfire footprints now within the state. They're in a condition that I would say represents what was at the time of the first fires. It's a landscape that is a fresh opportunity to come in and steward. And so we're actually looking at where and how we can put indigenous stewardship back in these places so that they can become resilient again. In the footprint of the Dixie Fire, in the footprint of all of the fires that we see, and also just using wildfire where it's appropriate in the places. But indigenous leadership in these places is really important to help us to guide the ways that we can navigate through what that potential future change might be. And that takes me into a case study I think is interesting, and this is a non-fire example of one that I've been involved with partners that I never thought I would work with at Metwater. And Metwater several years ago bought 4 Delta Islands, roughly 20,000 acres of land, and they approached me a few years back and said, we would like to do some design concepts around restoration of these islands, and we're going to pick one island as a team, and we're going to frame out what that might look like, planning out to 2075, I think it is. So long-term planning, most planners are not thinking that far. I think much further than that. All my planning is going like 200, 500 years out, but we're starting with something. And they asked me to lead a team around ecocultural restoration. And at first they thought the ecocultural restoration was only going to be, hey, we know that people need access to materials to go weave with. We know that people maybe want to have some places to go do some fishing and some hunting and some other activities. So help us identify some places within the landscape where that could be. So we're looking at islands that range in size from 4,000 to 6,000 acres roughly. And I said, it's not just about those little places, it's about the big picture. And so by engaging in that space, we were able to look at various considerations of not only the things that are of cultural importance, but various remnant features within the landscapes that are still functional, the ecological benefits of the restoration, the agricultural connections, the water quality, all of those things ultimately came together, and it ended up being that the ecocultural restoration framework that I put together was something that the teams of folks, some of them working in the Delta as engineers and other things for their entire careers, 30, 40 years, had never even thought of. And so the ecocultural framework became the hub of everything else. And I'll take you through a quick process just to kind of show how I approached it in working with other cultural practitioners around this. But we looked at things like soils and what the soil surveys tell us about the native vegetation. We use our traditional knowledge of those landscapes to say, well, we know that these story places are in this area, or we know that these specific plants or animals are known from these places from our stories. And we combine that information to ultimately then put together a map of an island. In this case, it was the chosen island, which is Bolden Island, 6,000 acres, to frame out what that restoration could look like. As you can see here, I've identified like old tidal sloughs that were part of this island when you know, in the early days before it was converted to agriculture, and really starting to vision that. And ultimately, this is what the team came up with. So it doesn't necessarily include every element of what I identified from the ecocultural perspective, but what we see is that it includes a lot of those elements in terms of upland, transition zones, wetlands, and other features, and tries to utilize some of the currently disturbed things to kind of create what maybe that novel ecosystem future might be for this area. So there's an opportunity that's there around stewardship, capacity, and also recognition of reciprocity. And I say this term reciprocity not only in relationship to the landscape, but also with each other through thinking about the recognition of knowledge base, training systems, things like that that are important. And at this point in time, we're in a phase of community building. You know, there's a lot of indigenous peoples who, as practitioners, tend to work by themselves, maybe within their families. They're the leaders of retaining that knowledge, but because of the impacts of colonization and discontinuity of cultural practice and community, there's a growth in this community building, like reconnecting and knowing each other, right? As neighbors, as family, as friends, as enemies, like it's all there, right? And then it's about also then building the capacity to do the work that needs to take place to be resilient. And it includes everybody. It's not just, you know, a tribe or a family band, but it's everybody living in that place. And think about like being here on the San Francisco Peninsula in Ramaytush country. You know, there aren't very many Ramaytush people, but as we work together, like we can all help Ramaytush achieve what that landscape should be, what this landscape should be. There's a need for intergenerational learning. You know, when I go out and I do things, I've always brought my kids with me. I've got 2 daughters. One's now, what is she, 14, and one's 17. But they've been out doing this stuff with me since they were 6 months old, as an example. And they're now able to lead some of this stuff. And we're out in the field doing things with elders. So this intergenerational opportunity is really important. It's not just about a younger workforce or an older workforce. It's about all people being able to work together. And then the planning and learning that goes along with it. I'll kind of try to go through some of these a little bit quickly. Yeah. So there's a lot of work in policy that's now coming around to support Indigenous stewardship, and I've been able to engage in that space quite a bit through the development of the Good Fire Report, my work on the task force as examples. The 30 by 30 piece is another one that comes up. But the one that I think is most important that I really want to share with you all is the Stewardship Project. So this is a federal policy initiative that I'm currently co-leading with Scott Stevens, who's at Berkeley, and Sarah Clark, who's probably living at her house right now, not too far from where we're at, as a lawyer, to frame this around stewardship within the Western states. So we formed a coalition of folks, Indigenous peoples and academics from Western institutions and organizations to frame this idea of a federal policy around stewardship. Because we're seeing and recognizing the changes aren't going to, what do I say? The changes we're seeing are so rapid that unless we take some bold steps, we're going to lose it all. And so our stewardship policy has 4 key elements. One is recognizing the tribal right to steward, workforce and capacity development, regulatory realignment. So thinking about regulatory realignment, just to highlight that for a moment, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Wilderness Act, all were written in a time that failed to recognize the role of Indigenous stewardship. And so we're talking about some changes there that then recognize the role of Indigenous peoples in stewarding the landscape so that it doesn't have to be regulated. And I can have other stories I could talk about that, but I'm going to move on. And the last piece is these ideas for what I'll call strategic fire zones. So where we can let fire be within the landscape and let it do the work that it needs to do when it's burning appropriately. So we have choices. We can continue to live in the cycle of severe wildfire and the feedbacks that it has, or we can work in this idea of the Indigenous fire feedbacks. When I talk about fire, I don't know if it's come through so much in my talk today, but it's also about water. It's about the biodiversity and all those sorts of things. So all of those are tied in up here in this diagram. I'll bring it to a close by just highlighting something that's fresh from this week. So on Monday, on our CSU Chico campus, we are actually able to bring fire back onto our campus proper. It's right in, if you've never been to Chico, Chico State sits right in the middle of campus. And we're setting fire in a place that was the traditional village of Ahopkee for the Mochupta. So using some of the legislation that we have within the state and some of these new policy changes, the tribe and me being there now for 18 years, I've been asking for the opportunity to bring fire. And it was actually an interview question when I had interviewed at Chico, like, could you burn in the city of Chico? And so combining the synergies that are there, we're actually able to work with Mochupta tribal members, Gila Ramirez in the back there. We've got a Hashmem student who's standing next or squatted down next to me, teaching about the stewardship of deer grass. And the very first burn, we said, we're going to do small burn to demonstrate stewardship of one plant species. And so that's our beginning. And that's what it looks like. And I'll say that this happened on a day that it was a no burn day. And the air quality regulator called me up in the morning, who happened to be a former student of mine. And she says, we've got a no burn day. I'm going to work on getting you an exemption for the day. She called me back about 10 minutes later and said, because it's a cultural burn, because of the educational values behind this, we're not only exempting this, but every burn that you want to do in the future on campus. So with that, I will bring it to a close. And thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for a couple questions, if anyone wants to stay.
I do have to run. I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm so excited at what you said about how these wildfires are opportunities to start Indigenous stewardship going forward. And I wonder, you talked about capacity building and training. How do you do it at scale? We have so many wildfires. Wouldn't it be great if we could take every single one of them but how do you bring that stewardship to scale?
Right. So scaling is something that definitely is on my mind quite a bit. To be honest, like a lot of Indigenous stewardship doesn't take a lot of people to be able to do. It's more of, again, reading the landscape and knowing where the opportunities are, and then having the permission and authority to do it. So I'll give an example of that idea of scaling. So in November of the year before the Dixie Fire, we'd gone up to the high country with my family, and I was like, man, the day's conditions are awesome for just, if I could do it, I would set fire along this road and back it down into this drainage. Just so one little dot. You know, this is how I look at the world, okay? Believe me, I'm even looking at it in the park here today, okay? But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, man, if I could do this, right? It would probably have burned maybe 1,000 acres if it was to carry the whole thing, but it would have been a low intensity burn. No opportunity to do it, no permission to do it. So I just, a mental thought in my head, I'm burning it mentally. Dixie Fire happens and Cal Fire does a backburn off of that same spot that I had looked at setting it 6 months earlier. That watershed's gone now. So it doesn't have to be a bunch of people standing in one place, setting a line of fire. It can be an individual going out and doing this, knowing that landscape and working in it. The ability to scale it also then requires picking places strategically for doing that kind of work. And that's where the Indigenous-led like stewardship frameworks is really important. The Forest Service has been doing these things around like potential operation delineation zones for wildfire. And I suggested to them, well, why don't you talk to the tribes about this? Like, let's really think about that conversation. And so the Forest Service has worked a little bit more with the Karuk tribe. They've worked more with the Washoe tribe and kind of case studies, and more information will be coming out about that. But I will share that that example of being able to work together in a case of a wildfire. This past summer with the fires up in the Klamath River, the Karuk tribe, after 20 years of trying to build this relationship, was actually able to go into the incident command and say, we're going to work in this way. And they achieved a lot of good fire in that time period with the Six Rivers National Forest and what they were doing. And there will be some narratives that come out about this in the near future, but they were able to achieve a lot that they had never been able to achieve before because of the willingness of the agencies to actually work with them. So it's that kind of change that needs to take place to actually get to scale. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I think we could take one more question.
Sorry I talked a little long. I
No,
tend to
it's
be
great.
long-winded.
We were a little late starting. Well, thank you all so much. And thank you, Dawn, so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.